The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden rays over the lively city square. People bustled about, some chatting animatedly, others snapping photos of the towering fountain at the center. The sound of laughter mixed with the distant hum of traffic created a symphony unique to urban life. Among the crowd stood Officer Mark Thompson, a man whose presence commanded respect without demanding it. With his neatly pressed uniform and calm demeanor, he was a reassuring figure in the chaos. Mark had spent years patrolling these streets, helping tourists find their way, reuniting lost items with their owners, and ensuring everyone stayed safe. Today, however, something unusual caught his attention. Near the edge of the fountain, a small boy sat on the ground, tears streaming down his cheeks. His tiny hands clutched a worn-out stuffed bear, as if it were his only lifeline. The sight tugged at Mark's heartstrings. Kneeling beside the child, Mark softened his voice. "Hey there, buddy," he said warmly. "Are you okay? Are you looking for someone?" The boy sniffled but didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked up at Mark with wide, watery eyes, unsure whether to trust this stranger in the uniform. Mark gave him a gentle smile. "It's all right. I'm here to help. Do you remember your mommy or daddy's name?" Before the boy could respond, a sharp, impatient voice cut through the air like a knife. "Excuse me, can I have your attention?" Startled, Mark turned to see a woman striding toward him. She wore designer sunglasses perched atop her head and carried an expensive leather bag slung over one shoulder. Her heels clicked loudly against the pavement as she approached, drawing curious glances from nearby pedestrians. "I need your help immediately," the woman declared, ignoring the crying child entirely. Her tone was brusque, almost dismissive, as though nothing else mattered except her own needs. Mark straightened up, trying to maintain his composure. "Ma'am, I'm currently assisting this young boy who appears to be lost. If you could wait just a moment." But the woman wasn't interested in waiting. "This can't wait," she interrupted, waving her phone in the air. "My battery is dead, and I need you to take me to the nearest charging station right now." Her words came out fast, each syllable dripping with irritation. Mark blinked, taken aback by her rudeness. He glanced down at the little boy, who had stopped crying momentarily to watch the exchange. Then, turning back to the woman, Mark explained patiently, "I understand your concern, ma'am, but I'm dealing with a priority situation here. Perhaps you could ask one of the vendors around the square for directions, or use the public map over there." He pointed toward a large signboard nearby. The woman huffed, clearly unimpressed. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath. "What kind of officer are you? You should be helping me first." Without another word, she spun on her heel and marched off, leaving behind a trail of indignation. Mark sighed, shaking his head slightly before refocusing on the task at hand, the lost child still sitting quietly beside him. Little did the rude woman know, her actions would soon lead to consequences far beyond what she anticipated. The woman who had stormed off was Evelyn Harper, a tourist visiting the city for the first time. She prided herself on her impeccable fashion sense and her knack for exploring new places, though in reality, she often relied heavily on her phone to navigate. Today, however, her device had betrayed her. Its battery had died just as she was about to check directions to her next destination, leaving her stranded and frustrated. Evelyn marched away from the square, muttering under her breath about how inefficient the local police were. "Who does that man think he is?" she grumbled, adjusting her sunglasses with an air of indignation. "I pay taxes when I'm home. Doesn't that count for something? Ugh, this whole city is so backward." Her heels clicked angrily against the pavement as she tried to figure out where to go next. She glanced around, hoping to spot someone who could help, but the crowd seemed indifferent to her plight. Tourists snapped selfies, vendors called out to passersby, and children chased pigeons near the fountain. No one paid any attention to Evelyn's obvious distress. For a moment, she considered going back to ask the officer again, but her pride wouldn't allow it. Instead, she decided to take matters into her own hands. "I don't need him anyway," she told herself firmly, squaring her shoulders. I'll find a charging station myself. How hard can it be? With that thought fueling her determination, Evelyn set off down a side street, confident that she'd stumble upon a cafe or shop where she could recharge her phone. But as she walked further away from the bustling square, the lively atmosphere began to fade. The streets grew quieter, the buildings less ornate, and the people fewer. At first, Evelyn didn't notice the change. She was too busy rehearsing what she'd say to Officer Thompson if she ran into him again. "See, I managed perfectly fine without your help," she imagined herself saying smugly. But soon, the unfamiliar surroundings started to unsettle her. The neat rows of shops gave way to narrow alleys lined with weathered brick walls. Graffiti covered some surfaces, and the faint smell of dampness lingered in the air. Evelyn paused, glancing over her shoulder. The comforting hum of the city square was nowhere to be heard now. A flicker of unease crept into her chest. "This isn't right," she murmured, pulling out her dead phone once more. She shook it futilely, as though willing it to turn on by sheer force of will. Nothing happened. Frustrated, she shoved it back into her bag and then continued walking, trying to convince herself that she'd find her way eventually. As she turned another corner, Evelyn spotted a small sign hanging crookedly above a doorway. It read Cyber Cafe in faded letters. Relief washed over her, and she quickened her pace. But when she pushed open the door, she found the space inside dark and abandoned. Dust coated the counters, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. Clearly, the place hadn't been operational in years. Disappointment hit her like a wave, and she stepped back outside, feeling more lost than ever. Her confidence wavered further as she realized she couldn't even remember which direction she'd come from. Every alley looked the same, twisting and turning like a labyrinth designed to confuse her. Panic began to creep in, tightening her throat and making her heart race. She stopped a passerby, a man carrying a toolbox, and asked for directions in broken phrases, pointing vaguely toward where she thought the square might be. The man shrugged, speaking rapidly in a language she didn't understand before continuing on his way. Evelyn stood there, frozen, as reality sank in. She was truly alone, with no phone, no map, and no idea how to get back to safety. For the first time since arriving in the city, she felt small and vulnerable. And deep down, a tiny voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, she should have listened to the officer after all. Evelyn's frustration reached a boiling point as she stood in the middle of the narrow alley, her mind racing with panic and regret. She clenched her fists tightly, trying to steady herself, but the weight of her predicament pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. The once confident tourist who had strutted through the city square now felt utterly defeated. Her designer clothes and expensive bag offered no comfort here. They were useless against the maze of unfamiliar streets and the sinking feeling of being completely alone. She tried to retrace her steps, turning left and then right, hoping to recognize something, anything, that might lead her back to the main square. But every corner she turned only led to more confusion. The alleys twisted unpredictably, some ending abruptly at dead ends, while others branched off into even narrower paths. Each step seemed to take her further away from where she wanted to be. Her heels, which had clicked so confidently earlier, now slowed her down, catching awkwardly on uneven cobblestones. The sun, which had been bright and warm in the square, now seemed distant, its light filtered through the tall buildings that loomed overhead. Shadows stretched long across the ground, making everything feel colder and darker. Evelyn shivered, though not entirely from the temperature. A strange silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional distant sound of footsteps or the faint hum of an unseen motorbike. It was eerie, almost unnatural, and it made her heart beat faster with every passing second. Desperation began to creep into her thoughts. "Think, Evelyn, think," she muttered under her breath, scanning her surroundings for any clue. She spotted a small grocery store tucked between two crumbling buildings and hurried inside, hoping someone could help. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with kind eyes, and a weathered face, greeted her with a polite nod. Evelyn pulled out her phone again, holding it up to show him it was dead, and gestured toward the door, mimicking walking motions to indicate she needed directions. The man tilted his head, clearly confused by her gestures. He responded in a language Evelyn didn't understand, speaking slowly as if to make sure she caught his meaning. When she shook her head, he smiled gently and pointed toward the street outside, saying something that sounded encouraging but remained incomprehensible. Frustrated tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes, and she forced herself to smile weakly before leaving the shop. The encounter left her feeling even more isolated, as though the world had conspired to leave her stranded. As she wandered aimlessly, Evelyn's mind replayed the events leading up to this moment. She thought about Officer Thompson, the calm, patient way he had spoken to her despite her rudeness, and cringed inwardly. Why hadn't she listened to him? Why had she let her pride get in the way? If she had simply asked politely or waited a few minutes, none of this would have happened. Now, instead of enjoying her vacation, she was trapped in a labyrinth of her own making, paying the price for her arrogance. Her feet ached, her throat was dry, and her confidence was shattered. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound startled her. She started imagining worst-case scenarios. What if no one found her? What if she couldn't find her way back before nightfall? These thoughts swirled in her head, amplifying her fear. Yet, amidst the chaos of her emotions, a glimmer of clarity emerged. Evelyn realized that her behavior earlier hadn't just hurt the officer, it had hurt herself. By dismissing his help, she had cut herself off from the very resource she needed most. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she heard a familiar voice calling out in the distance. At first, she wasn't sure if it was real or just her imagination playing tricks on her. But as the voice grew louder, accompanied by the steady rhythm of boots against pavement, hope flickered within her chest. Could it be possible? Was someone coming to her rescue after all? Evelyn froze in place, her breath catching in her throat as the distant voice grew louder. For a moment, she wasn't sure whether to feel relief or dread. Who could it be? Was it someone who could help her, or just another passerby speaking a language she couldn't understand? Her heart pounded as she strained to listen, her eyes scanning the dim alley for any sign of movement. The shadows stretched long across the ground, making it hard to see clearly, but soon enough, a figure emerged from around the corner. To Evelyn's astonishment, it was Officer Thompson. His uniform stood out starkly against the drab surroundings, and his calm presence felt like a lifeline in the chaos. He walked with purpose, his flashlight cutting through the gloom as he called out softly, "Hello? Is anyone here?" His voice carried a reassuring warmth that made Evelyn want to cry with gratitude. For a split second, pride held her back. She hesitated, unsure how to approach him after the way she treated him earlier. But exhaustion and fear quickly overpowered her ego. Taking a shaky step forward, she croaked, "Officer, I'm here." Her voice cracked under the weight of emotion, and she cleared her throat, trying to regain some semblance of composure. Mark turned toward the sound, his expression shifting from concern to recognition. When he saw Evelyn standing there, disheveled and visibly shaken, his demeanor softened further. "Ma'am," he said evenly, though without judgment, "are you all right? What happened?" Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. How could she explain the mess she'd gotten herself into? Instead, she gestured weakly at her surroundings and held up her dead phone, offering it as if it were evidence of her misfortune. I got lost," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "My phone died, and I couldn't find my way back." Mark nodded slowly, his trained instincts kicking in. "It's easy to lose your bearings in this part of the city," he said gently. "These alleys can be confusing even for locals." He paused, studying her face for a moment before continuing. "Let's get you back to the square. You must be tired." The simplicity of his words struck Evelyn deeply. There was no accusation, no hint of resentment, just genuine concern. It was a stark contrast to the way she had treated him earlier, and guilt washed over her like a tidal wave. She looked down at her feet, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm sorry," she blurted out suddenly, surprising even herself. "For before, I shouldn't have been so rude. I should have listened to you." Mark raised an eyebrow slightly, clearly taken aback by her apology. Then, after a brief pause, he gave her a small, understanding smile. "We all make mistakes," he replied simply. "What matters is learning from them." His tone was measured but kind, and it only made Evelyn feel worse about her earlier behavior. As they began walking back toward the main square, Evelyn struggled to keep pace with Mark's steady strides. Her legs ached from hours of aimless wandering, and her mind raced with thoughts of everything that had gone wrong. Yet, despite her physical discomfort, she couldn't help but notice how different the city felt now. With Mark leading the way, the once intimidating alleys seemed less threatening. His presence brought a sense of order to the disorder she'd experienced, and she realized how much she had underestimated him earlier. "Thank you," Evelyn murmured quietly as they reached a wider street, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. "For coming to find me. I don't deserve it." Mark glanced at her briefly, his expression thoughtful. "Everyone deserves help when they need it," he said firmly. "That's why I'm here, to assist people, no matter what." His words lingered in Evelyn's mind as they continued their journey. For the first time since arriving in the city, she felt truly humbled. The experience had stripped away her arrogance, leaving behind a raw vulnerability that forced her to confront her own flaws. As they neared the familiar sights and sounds of the bustling square, Evelyn knew one thing for certain. This trip would leave a lasting impression, not because of the landmarks she'd seen, but because of the lessons she'd learned about humility, patience, and the importance of treating others with respect. As Evelyn and Officer Thompson stepped back into the bright, lively atmosphere of the city square, the contrast between where she had been and where she was now hit her like a rush of fresh air. The square buzzed with energy. Children laughed as they chased pigeons around the fountain. Street musicians played cheerful tunes on their guitars, and vendors called out to passersby, offering snacks and souvenirs. It was a stark reminder of how far she had strayed, not just physically, but emotionally. Evelyn took a deep breath, letting the familiar sights and sounds wash over her. For the first time in hours, she felt safe. Yet, instead of relief washing away her earlier feelings of guilt, it only amplified them. She glanced at Officer Thompson, who walked beside her with an easy confidence that made him seem almost larger than life. His calm demeanor and quiet strength had saved her when she least deserved it, and she couldn't help but feel small in comparison. "Here we are," Mark said, gesturing toward a bench near the fountain. "You can rest here for a moment if you'd like." His voice was gentle, devoid of any judgment or superiority. Evelyn nodded gratefully and sank onto the bench, her legs trembling from exhaustion. She set her bag down beside her and stared at the ground, unable to look directly at him. After a moment of silence, Mark spoke again. "This city can be overwhelming for visitors," he began, his tone conversational rather than accusatory. "I've seen plenty of tourists get turned around, even in areas they think they know well. It's not uncommon." Evelyn looked up at him hesitantly, surprised by his attempt to make her feel less foolish. "Still, I should have listened to you earlier," she admitted softly. "If I hadn't been so rude, none of this would have happened." Mark shrugged slightly, as if to downplay her apology. Everyone has moments when they're frustrated or stressed. What matters is how we handle those situations, and how we grow from them. He paused, then added with a faint smile, "Besides, getting lost isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it gives us a chance to see things differently." His words lingered in Evelyn's mind, sparking a flicker of curiosity. "See things differently," she repeated, tilting her head slightly. Mark nodded. When people are lost, they often realize how much they rely on others, or how quick they are to dismiss help when it's offered. It's humbling, sure, but it can also teach us to appreciate kindness and patience, both in ourselves and in others. Evelyn sat quietly, absorbing his words. She thought about her behavior earlier, the way she had brushed off Mark's attempts to assist her, the entitlement she had displayed, and the consequences that followed. It wasn't just about being lost. It was about losing sight of basic human decency. She had treated someone who was trying to help her as though he were beneath her, and the universe had responded accordingly. Now, sitting here under the watchful eyes of the officer, she understood the lesson loud and clear. Humility wasn't weakness, it was strength. "I guess I needed this," Evelyn said finally, her voice tinged with both regret and gratitude. "Not just to find my way back, but to remember what really matters. Being kind, listening, not taking people for granted." She glanced at Mark, her expression earnest. "Thank you for everything. Not just for finding me, but for being patient with me, even when I didn't deserve it." Mark smiled warmly, his gaze steady and reassuring. "You're welcome," he replied simply. "And don't be too hard on yourself. Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is that you're willing to learn from them." As Evelyn sat there, watching the world go by, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. This trip, which had started as a carefree adventure, had become something far more meaningful, a journey of self-reflection. She realized that while landmarks and photos might capture memories, experiences like this one shaped character. And though she still had much to learn, she knew she wouldn't forget the lessons she'd gained today, or the officer who had unknowingly guided her toward them. After a few moments of quiet reflection on the bench, Evelyn finally mustered the courage to speak again. "Officer Thompson," she began hesitantly, her voice tinged with both gratitude and lingering embarrassment, "can I ask you something?" Mark turned his attention fully toward her, his expression open and attentive. "Of course," he replied warmly. "What's on your mind?" Evelyn hesitated, fidgeting with the strap of her bag as she gathered her thoughts. "How did you know where to find me?" she asked at last. "I mean, I was so far away from the square. Did someone tell you I was lost?" Mark chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not exactly," he explained. "After I finished helping the little boy reunite with his parents, I noticed you weren't around anymore. Something about the way you stormed off earlier stuck with me. You seemed upset and determined, but also, well, a bit unprepared." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "So I decided to check some of the nearby streets, just in case. When I didn't see you right away, I started asking shopkeepers and residents if they'd seen anyone matching your description." Evelyn's eyes widened in surprise. "You went looking for me, even after how I acted?" She couldn't hide the disbelief in her voice. Mark shrugged modestly. "It's my job to look out for people," he said simply. "Besides, no one deserves to be stranded, especially in an unfamiliar place. Your attitude earlier might have made things difficult, but that doesn't change the fact that you needed help." His words struck Evelyn deeply. Here was a man who had every reason to hold a grudge. Yet, instead of judging her or leaving her to fend for herself, he had gone out of his way to ensure she was safe. It was a level of compassion she hadn't expected, and it left her feeling both humbled and inspired. "I don't know what to say," Evelyn admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "except thank you, again, for everything." She looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly together in her lap. "I'm not usually like this, you know. I'm normally more considerate, or at least I try to be. I think the stress of traveling got to me, and I let my frustration take over. But that's no excuse for how I treated you." Mark nodded thoughtfully, his gaze steady and kind. "Traveling can do that to people," he said with a small smile. "New places, new challenges. It's easy to feel overwhelmed. The key is remembering that we're all human. We all make mistakes, and we all need help sometimes. There's no shame in that." Evelyn felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. She didn't want to cry. Not here, not now. But Mark's words resonated with her on a profound level. For years, she had prided herself on being independent, on never needing to rely on others. But today had shown her just how fragile that independence could be. Without realizing it, she had built walls around herself, dismissing those who tried to help and assuming she could handle everything alone. Now, sitting beside this patient, selfless officer, she understood how misguided that mindset had been. "Do you mind if I ask you something else?" Evelyn ventured cautiously, glancing up at him. When he nodded, she continued, "Why are you so calm, so understanding? Most people would have been angry after the way I acted." Mark laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine. "Let's just say I've been doing this long enough to know that anger doesn't solve anything," he replied. "When someone lashes out, it's usually because they're scared or frustrated, not because they're a bad person. My job isn't to judge, it's to help. And honestly, seeing someone recognize their mistakes and grow from them is one of the most rewarding parts of what I do." Evelyn smiled faintly, feeling a newfound respect for the man beside her. In that moment, she realized that Officer Thompson wasn't just a guardian of the city. He was a teacher, a guide, and perhaps even a mirror reflecting the best version of herself. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the square, Evelyn stood up slowly, steadying herself on weary legs. "Well," she said, turning to face him, "I should probably get going. My hotel's not too far from here, and I think I've kept you long enough." Mark rose to his feet as well, offering her a polite nod. "Take care of yourself, Miss Harper," he said with a reassuring smile. "And remember, kindness goes a long way. Whether you're traveling or just living day to day, it's always worth it." Evelyn nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. As she walked away, she glanced back once more to see him standing there, watching her leave with a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. For the first time in hours, she felt truly grounded and ready to embrace the lessons this unexpected detour had taught her. Evelyn walked away from the square, her steps slower and more deliberate than before. The weight of the day's events still lingered in her chest, but it wasn't the crushing burden of guilt or fear anymore. It was something else, something quieter, yet profound. She felt lighter, as though she had shed a layer of herself that no longer served her. Each step carried a newfound awareness, not just of where she was going, but of who she wanted to be. As she made her way toward her hotel, Evelyn replayed the conversation with Officer Thompson in her mind. His words echoed softly, like a mantra guiding her thoughts. Kindness goes a long way. She realized now how much truth there was in that simple statement. Kindness wasn't just about being polite. It was about connection, understanding, and recognizing the humanity in others, even when they were at their worst. And today, she had failed miserably at that. But failure, she reminded herself, wasn't permanent unless she let it define her. The streets leading to her hotel were familiar this time, lined with shops and cafes bustling with evening activity. Tourists strolled by, some laughing, others consulting maps or snapping photos. A group of children played near a lamppost, their joy infectious. Evelyn paused for a moment, watching them chase each other in circles, their laughter ringing out like music. It struck her then how easy it was to overlook these small moments of beauty when you were too busy focusing on yourself. She thought about all the times during her trip, before today, that she had rushed past scenes like this without a second glance. Her itinerary had been packed with landmarks to visit, pictures to take, and checklists to complete. But what had she really gained from it? Sure, she'd have plenty of photos to show friends back home. But would those images capture the essence of her journey? Or would they simply serve as reminders of places she'd seen, rather than lessons she'd learned? By the time Evelyn reached her hotel, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The lobby was warm and inviting, filled with the soft hum of conversation and the faint aroma of fresh coffee. She approached the front desk to ask for directions to a nearby electronics store, hoping to buy a portable charger so she'd never find herself stranded again. As she waited, She noticed a young couple struggling with a map, their expressions mirroring the frustration she had felt earlier that day. Without thinking, Evelyn stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said gently, catching their attention. "Are you too lost? I might be able to help." The couple looked up, surprised but grateful. They explained that they were trying to find a specific restaurant, but couldn't seem to locate it on the map. Evelyn studied the crumpled paper for a moment, pointing out key landmarks and offering clear directions. When they thanked her profusely, she smiled, not because she wanted praise, but because it felt good to give back. For the first time in a long while, she understood the value of helping someone simply because they needed it. Back in her room, Evelyn sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. She pulled out her journal, a habit she hadn't kept up with since arriving, and began to write. She wrote about the boy clutching his stuffed bear, the officer who had shown her grace despite her rudeness, and the strangers whose lives briefly intersected with hers. She poured her heart into every word, capturing not just the events of the day, but the emotions behind them. When she finally closed the journal, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. This trip had started as an escape, a chance to explore new places and collect memories, but it had become something far greater. It had forced her to confront her flaws, embrace humility, and rediscover the importance of kindness. And though she knew she still had much to learn, she also knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't forget the lessons she'd gained today, or the man who had unknowingly helped her grow. Tomorrow, she decided, would be different. Instead of rushing through her plans, she would take her time, savoring each moment and appreciating the people around her. Because life, she realized, wasn't just about destinations, it was about connections. And sometimes, getting lost was the only way to truly find yourself. The next morning, Evelyn woke up earlier than usual, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. The sunlight streamed through the hotel window, casting golden patterns on the floor, and for the first time since arriving in the city, she didn't reach for her phone right away. Instead, she took a moment to sit by the window, sipping a cup of tea and watching the world come alive outside. Street vendors set up their carts, joggers passed by with earphones in, and the distant sound of church bells filled the air. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous day. After finishing her tea, Evelyn grabbed her bag and headed out, determined to approach the day differently. Her first stop was a small cafe she had noticed during her wanderings the day before. It wasn't listed in any guidebook or recommended by travel blogs, but something about its cozy exterior had caught her eye. As she stepped inside, the aroma of freshly baked bread and brewed coffee greeted her warmly. She ordered a pastry and struck up a conversation with the barista, asking about his favorite spots in the city. To her surprise, he suggested a quiet park tucked away from the tourist-heavy areas, a place where locals often went to relax. Following his directions, Evelyn found herself in a serene green space surrounded by tall trees and winding pathways. Families picnicked on blankets, elderly couples strolled hand in hand, and children played tag near a small pond. It was a far cry from the crowded landmarks she had visited earlier in her trip, and yet it felt more authentic somehow. She sat on a bench overlooking the water, taking in the simplicity of the scene. For once, she didn't feel the need to document everything on her phone. Instead, she simply enjoyed being present. Later that afternoon, Evelyn returned to the square where her journey had taken such an unexpected turn. The fountain sparkled under the midday sun, and the lively hum of activity reminded her of how much life thrived in this part of the city. She scanned the area, half expecting to see Officer Thompson patrolling nearby, but he was nowhere to be found. Still, she smiled at the thought of him, grateful for the role he had played in helping her see things differently. As she wandered through the square, Evelyn noticed a young woman struggling to carry several shopping bags while trying to keep an eye on her toddler. Without hesitation, Evelyn approached her. "Can I help?" she offered, gesturing toward the bags. The woman looked relieved and handed over one of the heavier ones. They exchanged a few friendly words before parting ways, but the brief interaction left Evelyn feeling fulfilled in a way that sightseeing never could. That evening, as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Evelyn reflected on her transformation over the past 2 days. She realized that the rude, impatient version of herself, the one who had dismissed Officer Thompson's help, felt like a stranger now. In its place stood someone more mindful, more compassionate, and more willing to embrace the unpredictability of life. Getting lost had been frightening, yes, but it had also been a gift, a chance to recalibrate her perspective and reconnect with what truly mattered. When Evelyn returned home after her trip, she couldn't stop talking about her experiences, not just the places she had visited, but the lessons she had learned. Friends and family listened intently as she recounted her misadventure in the alleys, her encounter with the kind officer, and the moments of connection she had shared with strangers along the way. Some teased her about getting lost, but others nodded knowingly, understanding that sometimes the best memories aren't planned. They are stumbled upon. Over time, Evelyn began incorporating those lessons into her daily life. She became more patient with coworkers, more attentive to friends, and more open to lending a hand whenever she saw someone in need. The story of her run-in with Officer Thompson became a personal reminder of the power of humility and kindness, a tale she would share whenever she needed a little inspiration. Looking back, Evelyn knew she wouldn't trade that chaotic, humbling day for anything. It had taught her that even when we stray off course, there's always an opportunity to find our way back, not just to where we started, but to a better version of ourselves. And though she may never see Officer Thompson again, she carried his wisdom with her wherever she went. Kindness goes a long way. In the end, Evelyn understood that true growth doesn't come from avoiding mistakes. It comes from learning from them. And thanks to one unforgettable detour, she had grown in ways she never imagined possible.